All right, you should have received questions for chapter 11, and if you'll take note, there are two dates on that. We split chapter 11 as we did chapter 10, and so we're only going to go halfway through. That's not exact by number of verses, but we're going to go approximately halfway through next week of chapter 11, and then we finish it the following week. So hang on to those questions. Those are for 2 weeks. Chapter 11 will be split. And so we did the same with chapter 10. Chapter 10 was split into two sections. We've covered the first 18 verses. We're ready to pick up in Hebrews 10 and 19. And that is a pivotal point because of the how we've outlined the book, and so we're going to head there now. The book of Hebrews divides itself into two major sections. Some would say chapters 1 to 9 and then chapters 10 to 13. More accurately, it would be split right here in the middle of chapter 10. But be that as it may, usually when someone talks about the first 9 chapters, they're encompassing the spillover, as I may call it, into chapter 10. It gives the first 18 verses. But anyway, Christ is the way is the first major section. And then the second major section is don't give up. Under Christ is the way, we're going to summarize that here in a moment. I'm going to ask you to do that. But anyway, it's... The point here is twofold. That is the superiority of Christ's person. We saw he's superior to angels. He's superior to prophets. He's superior to Moses. Then we saw the superiority of his work, a superior priesthood, better covenant, better sanctuary, and superior sacrifice. Now we're shifting gears, starting with this verse here. This is where perhaps a good chapter division, remember chapter divisions are supplied by man. This may have been a good place to divide of chapters 9 and 10. But be that as it may, the focal point here is don't give up. Keeping the faith, chapter 10, 19 to 39. That's where we are today. We'll see examples of faith, endurance of faith, and the performance of faith. So we're looking at the concept primarily of keeping the faith. Let's review the first 10 chapters, including the first part of this chapter, what chapter 10 is about. So chapter 1, what's it about? All right, Christ is superior to prophets and to angels. Chapter 2. He's divine and human. Here is the harmony of the humanity of Christ. He's made lower than the angels, but at the same time, he's superior to angels. How could that be? Chapter 2 tells us that. So chapter 3 was about what? Yeah, he's superior to Moses and don't harden your heart. This is one of those warning sections that we'll get to here in a moment. Chapter 4. Yeah, warning not to fail and to hold fast. Chapter 5. Better high priest. That was introduced for us in chapter 4, remember, but he starts developing it here in chapter 5, and he'll do more in chapter 7. So chapter 6 we called an interlude. It kind of stops and pauses, put in parentheses. Here is what in chapter 6? Yeah, encouragement to go on into maturity. He mentioned at the end of chapter 5 they were lacking in maturity. Chapter 7 comes back to... Yes. Chapter 8. All right, yeah. A better ministry and a better priesthood. Talks about a better covenant. Chapter 9. Yeah, it's a type of the new. And then chapter 10, where we are, we introduced last week. What's chapter 10 all about? Yes, sacrifices and exhortation. All right, you tell me, how would you summarize chapters 1 to 9, or more technically, 1 in verse 1 to 10 and 18? How would you summarize in 1 or 2 sentences what we've covered so far, which is the foundation? Christ is superior to all. All right, what else? All right, have it so much better than the old. What else? One sacrifice is sufficient. There were many under the old covenant. Yeah, I think, and all of these are good. These are all correct. I'm just interested how you would summarize it. I think I would summarize it as I did on the outline, Christ is the way. But I think his point is You are on the right course. Don't let these false teachers pull you and the persecution pull you in the wrong direction. Christ is the way. You are on the right course, and it's the true course. And so stay on that course, and now he's ready with that foundation to say, keep on keeping on. Here's a practical thing to learn from that. Sometimes maybe somebody is discouraged and they're about to go off and it looks like they're being led away by false teachers or discouragement. And so maybe we rush to them and say, just keep on keeping on, and we don't give them the foundation. And maybe if we took the time to build the foundation that, look, you're on the right course, what you have been taught and what you believe is the truth. Here is the evidence of that. Now with that foundation, you keep on keeping on. Does that make sense? Start with the foundation and then go from there. All right. We are now ready. We're entering into the fourth of the warning section. Remember, we've talked about the doctrinal warning contrast, that there's a doctrinal section followed by warning, doctrinal warning, doctrinal warning. And we've looked at the fourth of the doctrinal sections. We're now ready for the fourth of the warning sections as per this outline. And now we're talking about being steadfast. So let's get the rest of chapter 10. We saw the contrast in the sacrifices, 1 to 18. And now we're ready for the exhortation to be steadfast. And there are 4 exhortations here. This reminds me of what chapter we've already covered that stopped and warned a little bit. We just talked about it. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 where he stopped and warned, but now he's not stopping and warning. This is his main thrust from this point on, the warning. So here's what he's saying. You need to be steadfast. Don't give up. Keep pressing on. And he makes 4 arguments here. His argument is, number 1, exhortation to greater diligence. It's based upon the cleansing we have through Christ. We'll get to that. And then here's what greater diligence involves. There are 4 things that are listed in 24 to 31. And if you have the workbook, you've caught those. If you didn't, we'll give those here in a moment. Secondly, exhortation based on the danger of apostasy. That is, if you don't press on and keep on, you're going to fall back and lose your soul. Thirdly, here's exhortation based on the fact you've done it in the past. You've endured through trials and tribulations in the past is evidence you can do that now. And then fourthly, here is encouragement and exhortation based upon receiving the promise. There is a promise awaiting if you just hold fast to the end. And if you'll do that, here is the promise that you'll have salvation. Make sense? 4 exhortations here. Let's see if we can make sense of all of this. So let's start with verses 19 to 25. Exhortation to greater diligence. Let's take 19 to 22 first. In that, he's saying this exhortation to be diligent is based on the cleansing that we have through Christ. So let's start, verse 19. Therefore, brethren, having boldness, your translation may use the word confidence, to enter the holiest by the blood of Christ. The holiest has reference to heaven because of the parallel that is drawn through the book of Hebrews between the sanctuary and the church and the most holy place and heaven itself. It may have reference to the idea of entering into to heaven. That is, that we have confidence we can enter into heaven. But I think probably he's alluding to a principle that we saw back in chapter 4. So let's go back to chapter 4 for a moment. That based on the fact that we have this high priest, that we can look at verse 16. We have a high priest that sympathizes with all of our weaknesses. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace. That's where the throne of grace is in heaven. And he has entered into the most holy place, heaven. That's where Christ is, in the most holy place, in heaven. And so I think it probably, though it includes the boldness and the confidence to go to heaven, and you say, I think he's talking about going to heaven. Okay, I'm good with that. But I think he's probably alluding to that principle back in chapter 4, that because of the cleansing, we can come boldly to God. We have the confidence we can come before God in time of need, in time of discouragement. But be that as it may, excuse me, at the end of verse 19, this is made possible how? By the blood of Christ. All the sacrifices we've been talking about, through that sacrifice, and because of that, we can come boldly to the throne of his grace. Now look at verse 22, or verse 20, Verse 20, by a new and a living way. That is, the way of Christ is called the new and the living way. It's new in the sense it's fresh or recent as opposed to the old, but the living gives me a little pause. Two or three possibilities. One is it may be living as opposed to the lifeless entrance into the most holy place of the tabernacle. So as the parallel has been drawn, you enter into the tabernacle, that way or that entrance into the most holy place was not living. It was what God designed, but it's not alive. Christ is the living way. He is that door through which we enter. I like what Lenski said. Lenski says, and if you have the workbook, you have this quote, this living way, this way is living because it consists of Christ himself, who is the way and the life, John 14:6. A way that is in itself, a way that is itself active and bears those who step upon it. We go further to say that it is living because of its connection with the living Christ, and the living Christ himself is the living way. In other words, Christ is the way and the means of entering into heaven. I think that's his point. Now, that's maybe a little more verbose way of expressing it, but I think that Lenski captured the thought. Now, at the end of verse 22, let us draw near with verse 20. The new and the living way, which he consecrated for us through the veil that is his flesh. What's that mean?
I have a note that where I made it from you. Says just as the veil had to be opened to pass through, Christ's flesh had to be opened to pass through.
All right. Yeah, it's through his flesh, through his death, that he opened the veil to enter. In other words, the veil would not be open for us to enter into heaven, to have access into heaven, were it not for his death. That's the point. And having a high priest over the house of God, there's a connection with him being high priest and this boldness back at verse 19, or this confidence. And that's why I'm connecting it back to Hebrews chapter 4. Now then, at verse 22, to finish that first section, he said, let us draw near with a true heart of full assurance. What does that mean? That we draw near to God with a true heart of full assurance. What's the true heart? A sincere, a genuine heart with full assurance. That is, without any doubt, because of the high priest we have. We don't have any doubts about our approach to God, our confidence before God of entering into the throne of grace or entering into heaven in eternity, because he is our high priest. Now, that boldness that we talked about at verse 19, let us draw near with a true heart of full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience. What does that refer to? If your heart is sprinkled from an evil conscience, it's just a description of the forgiveness of sins. Yeah, being forgiven. That's all it's talking about. That your conscience is evil because of sin. And being sprinkled means it's been cleansed and is purified. And then at the end of that, and our bodies are washed with pure water. I take that to be a reference to baptism. Others may think that it has reference just to a cleansing and that it's not the water doesn't refer to baptism. I think it probably does refer to baptism. But be that as it may, it's a cleansing. We're going to come out at the same point either way. But it's a cleansing. And the idea of it being washed with pure water is, I think, an allusion to Numbers chapter 29. It doesn't refer to the sanitary conditions of the water in which you're baptized. You could be washed and baptized in the Duck River and that be satisfactory because you've been immersed in water. But it means it's not mixed with ashes as per Numbers 19. That's what he's talking about. Not like the cleansing and the sprinkling that was Numbers 19 that had to be mixed with ashes. You're just washed in pure water, unmixed with ashes is the idea. But whatever you're thinking, baptism or just a cleansing, just a figurative expression for cleansing, you come out at the same point. We've been cleansed from our sins. So let's not miss the point that we are exhorted to greater diligence because of this cleansing we have through Christ, and we can draw near to God with a clear conscience because our conscience has been cleansed. Questions or comments on 19 to 20 about how we have this confidence based on the cleansing through Christ? All right, more importantly, not that that's not important, but I think here gets to the heart of what he's trying to say in 23 to 25. And here's what that greater diligence involves. If we don't have 23 to 25 to say we need to be more diligent, then we stop. Well, what do you mean more diligent? Well, he's going to give us 4 things. Watch for the 4 things in this context. So he's now telling us what greater diligence involves. Beginning at verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. What does that mean? All right, without doubt? Without wavering, without doubt? The New International translates that the hope that we profess. In other words, hold fast to the hope that you profess. You have the hope of eternal life, and you profess that. What does it mean to hold fast to that hope?
Don't lose sight.
Don't lose sight?
And to hold fast.
All right. Is it possible to hold on to something but not hold it tight? Suppose someone puts a newborn baby in your hand and you just kind of loosely handle it. What's liable to happen? You're holding it, but you're not holding it tight. Drop it, you hold it, you lose it. But if they say hold on to it tight, what does that suggest? You're going to secure it so that you're not going to lose that. So the idea here of holding fast, you hold on to that hope and you hold on to it for dear life like it may get away from you. Does that make sense? You hold on to it like you're not going to let anybody take that away from you. And so you hold fast. That's what's involved in diligence, holding fast the hope that we profess. Secondly, notice verse 24. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. What does that mean? Consider one another. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's 2 things involved in this. One is to consider one another. In other words, you give, not only think about yourself, but think about others who are going through the same kind of trial, tribulation. Give consideration to them. Think about them in order to, the New American Standard uses the word stimulate. What are you going to stimulate them to do? To have love and good works. How do you do that?
Set the example yourself to live like a Christian so that they can see Christ living in you, and therefore, it's like a little leaven leavens the whole lump. I think that works in a good sense too, not only in a negative sense.
Right.
That can be positive. You can be a positive example for your fellow Christians to look at and follow.
All right. One is setting an example. What else can I do? That's one of the ways we do that. All right, that's good. What else? All right, that's good. Let's look at the context. What do you think Paul is trying to stir up love and good works in this context? Of course he is. Yeah. So I might go to the person who is becoming discouraged and talk about what greater diligence involves. I might go to them and warn them of the danger of apostasy. I might encourage them saying, you know what, you've been faithful in the past, that tells me you can do it now. And I might tell them that if you keep on, you'll receive a promise. Would that stir up to love and good works? That was working for Paul. Seemed like that'd work for us as well. The third thing that he mentions, I said therefore, the third thing that he mentions in verse 25 is not forsaking the assembling of the saints. In In other words, greater diligence means not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's go and get the fourth thing. The fourth thing mentioned at the end of verse 25, or middle of verse 25, if you're not forsaking, but you're doing what? Exhorting and encouraging one another. And so much more as you see the day approaching. All right. Did you get the 4 points of what's involved in this greater diligence? Let's get them again. The first one is holding fast the hope that we profess. Secondly, considering one another to stir up or stimulate into love and to good works. Not forsaking the assembling and exhorting one another. That's what's involved in this context in being steadfast. Now let's pause for a moment and look at verse 25, because I think we would do an injustice to the text if we didn't stop and talk about some things in chapter 10 and verse 25. What use do you normally hear of Hebrews 10:25? Every one of us have heard this passage quoted many times. In a sermon, in a Bible class, and usually in the context, what are we usually saying with that verse? What are we point we're trying to make? All right, not forsake the assembly. We're trying to tell people that you need to be present. What pushback do you usually get from people who don't attend like they should about chapter 10:25? All right, there's some important things going on in their life, and so that's a good point. I want to come back to that. What else?
Studying their Bible or reading their Bible, and therefore they just come through the way.
All right.
Other than the Lord's Day, many people would say you don't have a command to assemble on you.
All right. Just one time on Sunday is enough for me. Time would forbid us to go in detail. I just want to look at 2 or 3 things here. Let's talk about this word forsaking. The word means to leave or to abandon or leave behind. And one of the arguments it's made is this is talking about a permanent abandonment, one who just completely quits the Lord. And I beg to differ. Would it be included? Certainly. But the word forsake can have reference to a one-time event. Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Was that over and over and over and over and over? Or was that he's talking about a one-time event there. All men forsook me, Paul would say in 2 Timothy 4:16. He's talking about a one-time event at his trial. It was something that could be repeated because, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, as the manner of some is. This was an oft-repeated thing. So if you completely abandon, you don't completely abandon, and then you again completely abandon, and then you again completely abandon, do you? All right? That's one principle. Let's talk about the word assembling. The text doesn't say assembly, but it says assembling. Vincent, by the way, Vincent Kubo and English, Greek, New Testament are lexicographers. Myers is a commentator, but the rest of them are lexicographers, and Kubo is a summary. Always gives a summary of BDAC. But anyway, for what that may be worth to you, those all say it has reference to the act of assembling, assemblies, or assembling. So it's not talking about don't forsake the assembly, the Sunday morning assembly, but the assembling of ourselves together. That's not really where I'm interested in going. I want to focus on the manner of some is. Apparently, look at that phrase. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some, or the King James says as the manner of some is. Barnes, some had the habit, before I look at the quotation from Barnes, some had the habit of forsaking. What was causing that? Now listen to this carefully. Either the text does not give us a clue, or the textual and historical context argues for persecution being the cause. So what does the text, well, the historical circumstance is they are under severe persecution. We know that. But let's look at some things here in the context. I'm not going to read the references. You are familiar with these. But like chapter 10 and in verse 32 to 34, they have endured in the past, they are to be enduring now. Chapter 12, we'll get to a little bit later. This scourging of the sun, that's persecution of verse 6, is a chastening of the Lord. It was discouraging to them, chapter 12 and verse 12. So the text, the context of, and you have not yet resisted unto blood, chapter 12. The point is, the context deals with persecution, the textual context. The historical context deals with that. Either that was causing them to forsake, or there was something else. And my question would be, what is the something else? What would be worse than persecution that was causing them to forsake? What was less than persecution that was causing them to forsake? And you're going to be at a loss to come up with anything other than persecution, or you're going to have to say, we're not even told, that we're not even given a hint. Listen to Barnes. Barnes said, some may have been deterred by the fear of persecution, as those who were thus assembled would be more exposed to danger than others. That harmonizes, by the way, with 1 Corinthians 7, about verse 30 to 34. Arthur Pink says the very same thing. In other words, those who were assembling were exposed to danger. And perhaps it was the fear of persecution was causing some to back away from assembling with the saints. Does that make sense? Whatever it was, Paul didn't think it was a legitimate excuse. Whatever it was, they should have assembled. Either we're not told or persecution is what's in the context. Now, what do you do with that information? If you say, okay, I get the point. This is probably persecution that was causing all that. What conclusion do you draw? None? Does that mean nothing to us? Yeah. See, that makes me question sometimes when somebody's missing because they're tired, or somebody misses because they offered overtime. See, I'm preaching to the choir because those that miss probably not going to be here till the next hour. I understand that. But maybe if we get this point, we can help teach some others. Does that make sense? It makes me question when, you know what, I feel a little bit bad. I'm not talking about where I'm contagious and I may spread something, but here with the fear of persecution, no, you don't need to forsake when you're afraid that you're going to be beaten or whatever. And then I'm thinking I'm not going to go tonight because I'm a little bit tired. I have a hard time with that one. Does that make sense? Am I the only one that thinks that's what the text is saying?
I noticed too, Donnie, he doesn't say, he doesn't promise them that they're not going to be persecuted. He doesn't say to them, you should go because those things aren't going to happen.
Yeah.
He never says that. He just says, you need to hold fast because the things that you were promised are going to be better than whatever you have to endure or suffer.
I think you're right. You're exactly right. I'm going to make a statement here, and you may think it's shocking, but I want you to think this through before you reject it. We're going to talk about Acts 12 in the sermon, and you may wonder why God allowed James to be killed and Peter to be saved. And my answer is, I don't know. But here's what I'm about to say. Death is not a big deal to God. And so you're persecuted and you're killed because God views the broader picture of life beyond. And death, hang on just a second, that death is not a big deal to God. Death is just not a big deal to God. So you say, why did he let my loved one die? Death's not a big deal to God. It is to you and to me, but to God it ain't a big deal. Does that make sense? So I may go and I may be persecuted and I may be killed, but death ain't a big deal to God. Now think about that before you reject that idea. Let's go further now at verse 26. Oh, by the way, at verse 26, as I do want to comment on this, so much more as you see the day approaching. I think that has reference to the destruction of Jerusalem. And my evidence of that was that it was something you could see approaching. There are signs of the second, not signs of the second coming, but signs of the destruction of Jerusalem. And as that got closer, the persecution got more severe. Zur makes this application, this shift, while he may think it refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, since that's already passed, then in principle it applies to us as we get closer and closer to eternity. He may be right about that, and I'll leave that for him, for you to accept or reject. Now, there's more could be said about chapter 10:25, but I want us to move on. Let's talk about the danger of apostasy. What's his point in 26 to 31? If you don't press on, finish my sentence. If you don't press on, there's no hope. If you don't press on, there is a danger that you're going to drift away and you'll end up losing your soul. So let's get the point. If we sin willfully after we've received a knowledge of the truth, there's no longer remains a sacrifice for sin. That is, there's not another sacrifice coming. You reject the sacrifice of Christ, I'll wait for the next one. There ain't going to be another. You just gave up the only one the only hope you've got. There's not another sacrifice coming. But here's what you do have. Verse 27. What do you look forward to? Instead of another coming sacrifice, judgment, a fearful expectation of judgment. Now, the one that rejected Moses died without mercy. In other words, they stoned him to death. So what's the point about that? Verse 29. Yeah, it's worse than dying without mercy, because you've done two things. You've trodden underfoot the blood of the covenant, under the foot the Son of God, and counted the blood of the covenant by which you were sanctified an unholy thing and insulted the Spirit of grace. Three expressions saying you've rejected God. You've insulted the Spirit, you've rejected the Spirit of God, you've rejected the blood and rejected the Son of God. By the way, for those who would argue that if you depart from God, that's evidence you never were in a relationship with God. They were sanctified by the blood and then they depart, according to verse 29. Now let's get verse 30. Where does he quote from? Deuteronomy 32 quotes verse 35 and then comes back and quotes verse 36, where God said, vengeance is mine. The point is, God will recompense. God will punish those that reject him. That's the point. And his conclusion from that, verse 31 is, yeah, it's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So what's his point? His point is that you need to keep pressing on, because if you don't, you're going to fall back and lose your soul. All right, let's go further. Based on past endurance, 32 to 34. Let's get that. But recall the former days after you were illuminated, you endured great struggle with suffering. Probably referring, if this is the church at Jerusalem, probably referring to Acts 4, Acts 5, even Acts 7, even Acts 8 and 9. There were great trials the church went through. After you obeyed the gospel, there were these great trials that you went through, and you endured that. Partly while you were made, there's two things in verse 33, made a spectacle both by reproaches and tribulation. That seems to be verbal abuse. While you became companions of those who were so treated, physical abuse. You were verbally attacked and you were physically attacked. You endured all of that. And not only that, but you had compassion on me and my chains and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods. What's the plundering of your goods? Yeah, they took what way? Their possessions. In other words, some form of persecution was killing, some of it was beating, some of it was putting in prison. Sometimes your house would be ransacked. So what would you do if you thought that because you went to church, not because of criminals looking to steal, but because of your faith, that the only reason you're being attacked is because you go to church, and if you go to church, your house is going to be ransacked. You probably want to stay at home. That's generally what we would do. I got to stay here and protect my goods. But he said, you endured that. You went through all of that, and that didn't crush your faith. And the reason for it at the end of verse 34, because your idea was that, you have a better and an enduring substance. Yeah, they stole my goods, but that's nothing like heaven. Yes, they ransacked my house, but that's nothing like my soul. Make sense? It would. And go ahead. Nothing about it at all. I believe as Matthew Henry said, when somebody stole from him, he said, I'm glad they stole from me and not me from them. I like that attitude. I think the idea of joyfully was not that I'm glad they did it, but they didn't take what's important. They took my possessions, they took my goods, they took my money, they took my furniture, they destroyed my house, but they didn't take what's important to me. They didn't take my hope and my soul. They didn't take that. And I'm glad they didn't get that, and I'm glad I didn't do them wrong. They're the ones who did me wrong. Absolutely. Now let's get 35 to 39. I know our time is about gone. We got about 3 minutes. Let's see if we can do this. The exhortation based on receiving the promise. Let's see if we can make some sense of this. At verse 35, do not cast away your confidence. Some have suggested that's the idea of casting down a shield, like being in a battle and you've got a shield that protects you, and the coward throws it down and retreats. Don't throw your shield down and give up and retreat. Don't cast away your confidence. The confidence that we talked about in chapter 10, 19, because it has great reward. Now what you need, verse 36, is what? Endurance. That's the idea of patience. Patience is not calmness. I don't know where it's ever used that way in Scripture. I don't know of a single place where it's ever used that way in Scripture. It always has reference to endurance. Here's patience. What you need is patience. You need endurance so that after you've done the will of God, you may what? Receive the promise. Now his quotation is from Habakkuk 2. For yet a little while he who is coming will come and will not tarry. In Habakkuk, that was used with reference to God's judgment, and it was coming from Babylon on God's people. In this context, because this is prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, I think he's talking about God's judgment on Jerusalem. Because in yet a little while he who's coming will come. And the just shall live by faith. What do you mean the just shall live by faith? That's explained in the next phrase. If anyone draws back, my whole soul has no pleasure in him. Instead of drawing back, you're going to live by faith. That is, you continue to believe. Now, and you say, how do you know that? Look at verse 39. We are not of those who draw back to perdition or destruction, but those who believe, and I think the sense is continue to believe to the saving of the soul. That's the idea of the just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. They will endure by faith because they continue to believe to the saving of their soul. So here's his point. His point is, I'm exhorting you to keep on based on receiving the promise. That you need endurance so that you'll receive that promise. And in a little while, he that's coming will come. That is, destruction is coming upon the enemy. And the Jewish nation is going to be utterly destroyed. And that's tempting, and that's a trying time for the Christian living in the midst of that. But you hang on for the promise at the end. Make sense?
Johnny, I think also, I do think it's the final promise of heaven. But they also, by enduring, survived the destruction of Jerusalem. It was the Christians who, there was a pause in fighting, and Josephus tells us they left because they had been warned through, their prophets and whatever. And so, pretty much everyone in that city died or were enslaved, but the Christians were saved through this. So, he's telling them, endure because you're going to reach heavenly gifts, but he's also saying, don't give up because this is what's going to save you when the city burns.
Yeah, it is. You remaining faithful is going to help you spare the problems of the city. Chapter 11 next time, we're going to go halfway through talking about examples of faith and build on this encouragement found right here in this context.